Would you abandon your flesh and blood for money? That's exactly what happened to Daniel Carter. Once, he had a family, a powerful, respected lineage built on old money and reputation. But to them, Daniel was nothing more than an unfortunate mistake, an heir who failed to live up to the Carter legacy. When he needed them most, they turned their backs on him, leaving him to fight for survival in a world that didn't care. Now, years later, Daniel stood in front of a towering glass skyscraper in the heart of New York City, the golden glow of sunset reflecting off its pristine windows. His name was etched in bold letters across the entrance, Carter Industries, the very empire his father had sworn he'd never be fit to inherit. But before he could claim victory, he had to relive the betrayal that nearly broke him. The Carters weren't just rich. They were the kind of wealthy that made politicians listen and billionaires jealous. Their real estate empire spanned continents, and their influence ran through the veins of high society, like a drug. But none of that mattered to Daniel. All he wanted was a family that saw him as more than an asset, a father who cared about something other than profits, and a mother who didn't look at him like he was a stain on their name. Instead, he got an upbringing dictated by cold stares, boardroom meetings, and relentless expectations. "Daniel, you are an embarrassment," his father's voice echoed in his mind, as sharp as the day it had been spoken. He was 17 when he heard those words, the moment that changed everything. It was the night of the annual Carter Gala, where Manhattan's elite gathered to drink champagne and whisper about whose fortunes had crumbled. Daniel had spent the evening avoiding his father's associates, sick of hearing them joke about the family legacy resting on his shoulders. Then his father, Richard Carter, found him. "I heard from the dean," Richard said, swirling the expensive whiskey in his glass. "Your grades are slipping." Again, Daniel clenched his jaw. "I don't want to take over the company. I want to study engineering." The slap came fast. "Hard. You are not meant for mediocrity," Richard growled. "You will obey or you will leave." His mother stood in the corner, silent as ever. "Mom," Daniel pleaded. She wouldn't even meet his eyes. That night, Daniel packed a single duffel bag and walked out of the Carter mansion. The last thing he heard before the heavy oak doors shut behind him was his father's voice. "You're no longer a Carter." The first few months were the hardest. Daniel had no savings, no credit, and no one to call. He slept in subway stations and scrounged for food, pride keeping him from seeking help. He found work as a dishwasher in a rundown diner, making barely enough to survive. The world didn't care that he was once a Carter, but he refused a break. One night, as he scrubbed plates, he overheard two men at the counter discussing stocks. "Text the future," one of them muttered. "If I had a dime, I'd put it in software startups." Daniel knew nothing about investing, but he knew how to learn. Every night after his shift, he'd go to the public library and read about stocks, businesses, and emerging technologies. He'd jot down notes on napkins, absorbing every word like a starving man. Months passed. He saved every spare dollar, cutting expenses until he could afford a cheap laptop. Then he made his first investment, $100 into a small AI startup. It was a risk, but he had nothing to lose. Just as things were looking up, the universe knocked him back down. Daniel had made a friend at the diner, a man named Kyle, who was in a similar situation. They spent nights talking about their dreams of escaping poverty. When Daniel started seeing returns on his investments, he shared what he learned with Kyle. "We're gonna make it out of this hell," Daniel had said, eyes burning with determination. But greed is an ugly thing. One night, Daniel checked his small brokerage account and found it emptied, every cent gone. Kyle had stolen his passwords, drained his investments, and disappeared. Daniel stood frozen in his apartment, one he could no longer afford. Betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. For the first time, he felt like his father had been right. Maybe he was a failure. But then, Daniel did what he always did. He fought. He took another job, working security at night and delivering food during the day. He rebuilt his savings, brick by painful brick. He studied harder, invested smarter, and learned to protect himself from people like Kyle. 3 years later, he had enough capital to launch his tech startup. A year after that, investors started noticing. By the time he was 26, his company, Nexus Innovations, was valued at $100 million. The world saw him as a genius entrepreneur, but Daniel knew the truth. He wasn't brilliant. He was just someone who had been forced to survive. Now, standing in front of Carter Industries, he smirked. It was time to show them what survival looked like. Would you fight for success if the entire world was against you? Daniel Carter had clawed his way from the depths of homelessness to the heights of wealth. But the road to success is never a straight line. Just when he thought he had conquered his past, the world threw him back into fire. Because when you rise, the powerful will always try to bring you down. Now, he stood at the edge of a battle that could cost him everything. The cold hit differently when you had nothing. Daniel knew hunger, the kind that gnawed at your ribs and made your stomach feel hollow. He knew exhaustion, the kind that made a park bench feel like a king's bed. But worst of all, he knew loneliness. It had been 6 years since he walked away from the Carter estate, but some nights, he still dreamed of warm beds and expensive meals. Then he woke up to reality. His tiny studio apartment was barely bigger than a closet. The heater worked only when it wanted to, and the landlord eyed him like he was one late rent payment away from eviction. And that day, the inevitable came knocking. Bang, bang, bang. Carter, open up. Daniel pulled the thin blanket tighter around himself. He already knew who it was. The door burst open, revealing a short, stocky man with a sneer, his landlord, Mr. Horowitz. "You're 2 months behind," Horowitz growled. "I warned you, Carter." Daniel swallowed hard. "I just need another week." Horowitz scoffed. "You said that last month. You think I'm running charity?" He threw a crumpled eviction notice onto the floor. "You have 24 hours. The door slammed shut behind him. Daniel sat there, staring at the paper in his hands. No home, no money. He thought about calling his father. Then he laughed bitterly. He would rather starve. Daniel was running out of options. He had managed to land a job as an intern at a finance firm, but the pay was a joke. His co-workers treated him like an insect, an outsider who didn't belong in their world. One evening, he overheard his boss, Mr. Walker, talking on the phone. "Look, we don't hire people like him long-term. The clients wouldn't like it." Daniel felt his stomach drop. He knew what that meant. He wasn't one of them. No Ivy League degree. No powerful connections. Just another poor kid trying to climb a ladder that had been pulled away. Still, he worked harder. 12-hour days. No breaks. No weekends. But when promotion time came, he was called into Walker's office. "Daniel," Walker said, not even looking up from his papers, "we're letting you go." Daniel's throat went dry. "Why? It's just not a good fit." That was it. No explanation. No severance. Just like that, he was unemployed again. With no income, bills piled up fast. Rent, loans, credit cards he had taken out just to survive. Debt collectors hounded him. "Mr. Carter, your payment is overdue." "Mr. Carter, if you do not respond, legal action will be taken." The worst was the hospital bill. One night, while walking home from a failed job interview, he had been jumped by 2 men in an alley. They beat him, stole his wallet, and left him bleeding in the snow. The hospital patched him up, but when he was discharged, they handed him a bill for $8,000. He almost laughed, as if he could afford it. Daniel had never felt so trapped. No matter how hard he fought, the world kept shoving him down. Then came the final blow. Just when Daniel thought things couldn't get worse, someone he trusted stabbed him in the back. He had one last hope, a business idea. Daniel had spent months researching stock trading algorithms. If he could develop software that predicted market trends, he could finally break free. There was only one problem: money. So he turned to the one friend he had left, Jake. Jake had been with him since the diner days, a fellow survivor. "I believe in you, man," Jake had said. "I can pitch your idea to some investors." Daniel had trusted him. Then one morning he saw the headlines. Jacob Lansing launches revolutionary stock prediction software, valued at $50 million. Daniel felt his heart stop. It was his software, his idea, Stolen. Jake had gone behind his back, taken his research, and sold it as his own. Daniel called him, shaking with rage. "You stole from me." Jake chuckled. "Come on, man. You thought a nobody like you could make it?" Daniel gripped the phone, blood roaring in his ears. Jake sighed. "Look, it's business. You had nothing. I made it happen." The line went dead. Daniel stared at his reflection. In the broken mirror, he had lost everything. Again. But Daniel refused to go down quietly. He found a lawyer willing to take his case. A young woman named Lisa, fresh out of law school, but hungry for a fight. They filed a lawsuit against Jake, accusing him of intellectual property theft. The courtroom was brutal. Jake had an army of lawyers. He laughed when he saw Daniel. "This is a joke," Jake said, smirking. "You have nothing." Daniel clenched his fists. Not for long. Lisa fought hard. She presented evidence, emails, timestamps, and coded documents proving that Daniel had developed the software long before Jake did. The courtroom murmured. Jake's smirk faltered. For the first time, he looked nervous, but the system was never fair. Jake's lawyers played dirty. They twisted facts, bribed witnesses, and used every trick in the book to bury Daniel. Then the judge spoke. The court finds no sufficient evidence to prove intellectual property theft. The case is dismissed. Daniel felt the world tilt. Jake walked up to him outside the courtroom, patting him on the back. "Tough luck, Carter," he said. "Welcome to the real world." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. Something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to fight the system anymore. He was going to beat it. Daniel disappeared for a year. No one knew where he went. Some said he moved to Silicon Valley. Others claimed he was working for a hedge fund. But the truth was far more dangerous. Daniel had spent every waking hour learning the system, its loopholes, weaknesses, and vulnerabilities. Then he came back with a plan, a masterstroke, one that would destroy those who had wronged him. And at the center of it all, Carter Industries, his father's empire, the same one that had cast him out. Now he was ready to take it. And he wouldn't stop until every last one of them regretted ever doubting him. Would you take revenge on the people who crushed you? Daniel Carter had been stripped of everything, his home, his dignity, and the business idea he had bled for. His own family had abandoned him. His so-called best friend had stolen from him, and the system had crushed him under its heel. But here's the thing about people like Daniel. They don't stay down, because when life takes everything, you have nothing left to lose. Now he was back, and this time he had a plan. Daniel sat in a dimly lit cafe in downtown Manhattan, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind racing. The past year had been brutal. He had gone underground, vanishing from the world, spending every moment studying how the wealthy and powerful operated. Most people believe success came from hard work. That was a lie. The rich played a different game. They didn't work harder. They worked smarter. They exploited loopholes. And Daniel had found one, a crack in the foundation of the financial world. It had started with an old, forgotten law buried deep in the corporate charter of Carter Industries. One night, exhausted and half-drunk on cheap whiskey, he had been skimming through the company's original founding documents, looking for anything he could use against his father. That's when he saw it. A single clause, buried under mountains of legal jargon. That changed everything. Carter Industries had been founded by Daniel's grandfather, Richard Carter. He was a brilliant but paranoid man, obsessed with protecting his legacy. And in his paranoia, he had written something unusual into the company's original bylaws. If at any point the company is found guilty of financial fraud, the entire board of directors must resign and ownership of the company will be transferred to the largest individual shareholder. Daniel read it twice, then a third time, and then it hit him. His father and the board had been engaging in shady financial dealings for years. Insider trading, market manipulation, fake shell companies to dodge taxes. Daniel had heard the rumors. If he could prove it, he could take the company. Not just get revenge, not just destroy his father's empire, but take it for himself. Daniel didn't sleep for days. He needed evidence, real, undeniable proof of financial crimes that would trigger the clause. But Carter Industries was a fortress. Their records were protected by the best cybersecurity money could buy. So he went after the weakest link, the insiders. He started digging into employees, people who had been fired, threatened, or betrayed by the company. He found one, Miles Henderson, a former accountant for Carter Industries. Laid off 5 years ago. Publicly, they claimed it was due to restructuring. Privately, Daniel had a feeling Miles had seen something he wasn't supposed to. Daniel tracked him down to a rundown bar in Brooklyn. Miles was a wreck, gray-streaked hair, bloodshot eyes, and the bitter look of a man who had lost everything. "You don't want to dig into this," Miles muttered, swirling his drink. "I do," Daniel said. "And so do you." Miles let out a hollow laugh. "Even if I had something, why would I help you?" Daniel leaned in. "Because I can make them pay for what they did to you." There was a long silence. Then Miles cracked, and he gave Daniel exactly what he needed. Miles had kept everything. Emails, financial statements, internal memos, and one document in particular stood out, a wire transfer. It was from Carter Industries to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A clear-cut case of financial fraud. Daniel's hands trembled as he stared at it. This was it. With this, he could activate the clause, but he had to be smart. If he moved too soon, the board would bury everything before he could take them down. So he needed one more thing. Daniel needed a way into Carter Industries. And there was only one person who could get him inside. Jake, the same man who had stolen his idea. The same man who had laughed his face after destroying his dream. Daniel had no reason to trust him, but Jake was greedy. And Daniel knew how to play to greedy men's weaknesses. So he reached out. "I have something bigger than the stock software," Daniel texted. Jake's response was instant. "Let's talk." They met in a penthouse suite overlooking the city. Jake smirked as Daniel walked in. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." Daniel forced a smile. "I've got a proposition." Jake leaned back. "I'm listening." Daniel slid the wire transfer across the table. Jake's smirk vanished. "Where did you get this?" Daniel didn't answer. "Carter Industries is about to go down, but if we play this right, we can take it for ourselves." Jake looked at the document again, then back at Daniel. For the first time in years, Jake looked scared, because he realized something Daniel had known all along. Daniel wasn't just trying to win. He was coming for blood. Daniel and Jake worked out a plan. Jake still had connections inside Carter Industries. Executives who owed him favors. Traders who would do anything for the right price. Over the next few weeks, they leaked carefully chosen bits of information. Small hints, subtle clues, enough to make financial regulators start sniffing around. Then, when the SEC launched its first investigation, they dropped the bombshell. Daniel sent the wire transfer evidence to the authorities. The next morning, Carter Industries headquarters was raided. It made national news. The board panicked. Stock prices plummeted. Investors pulled out. And just like Daniel had planned, the fraud was exposed. Then, the company's worst nightmare became reality. A federal judge reviewed the case and ruled that, according to the original corporate charter, the entire board, including Daniel's father, had to resign, and ownership would go to the largest individual shareholder. The media speculated on who that could be. Then, in the final, shocking twist, Daniel revealed himself. Over the past year, he had been secretly buying up shares, every last piece of Carter Industries stock he could get his hands on. He hadn't just taken them down, he had taken their empire. And as Daniel walked into the Carter Industries boardroom, his boardroom now, he smiled for the first time in years. Because his father wasn't just losing his company, he was losing it to the son he had abandoned. What would you do if the people who betrayed you were now at your mercy? Daniel Carter wasn't just rich now, he was powerful. But power was a dangerous thing. And the people he had just destroyed, they weren't going down without a fight. The boardroom was silent. 12 men and women sat around the long, glass table, their faces pale, their hands clenched. Daniel stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding. This was it. The moment he had dreamed of. Carter Industries was his. His father, Richard Carter, was nowhere to be seen. He had fled before the SEC raid, his lawyers scrambling to negotiate a plea deal. The other board members had no choice but to acknowledge reality. Daniel had won, but the victory was just the beginning. The first thing Daniel did was clean the house. Everyone who had been complicit in his father's crimes, gone. The CFO, fired. The corrupt executives, dragged into legal battles. Jake, his former best friend and now business partner, watched in shock as Daniel ruthlessly purged the company. "You're not holding back, huh?" Jake muttered. Daniel smirked. "Why would I?" Jake exhaled. "I thought you just wanted revenge." "I did," Daniel said. "Now I want more." The press exploded. The son who was abandoned. The underdog who became the king. Every financial network wanted an interview. Investors watched with curiosity. But there was one thing Daniel hadn't anticipated. Not everyone was happy that he had won. And some people, they wanted him gone. One night, Daniel was in his office when his phone rang. It was Miles Henderson, the ex-accountant who had given him the proof of the fraud. "There's something you need to know," Miles said, his voice urgent. Daniel frowned. "What?" "I found something else in the records. Something worse." Daniel's pulse quickened. "How much worse?" Miles hesitated. "Let's just say your father wasn't working alone." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" Miles exhaled. "The fraud? The offshore accounts? It wasn't just Carter Industries. It was bigger. A network of companies. Powerful people." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had just declared war on an empire he didn't even know existed. And these people, they wouldn't let him win so easily. Daniel wasn't a fool. He knew business wasn't just about money. It was about control. And if Miles was right, then Carter Industries had been part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. That night, Daniel sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. He had fought so hard to take power. Now he had to fight to keep it. His mind raced. Who else was involved? Banks? Government officials? Other billionaires? One thing was certain. Whoever they were, they had just become his enemies. And enemies like these? They didn't fight fair. The attack started subtly. First, Carter Industries stock plummeted overnight, wiped out by anonymous short sellers. Then, regulators suddenly reopened old investigations, threatening massive fines. And then, Daniel's bank accounts were frozen. Not just his corporate assets, his wealth. Jake stormed into his office the next morning, looking pale. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Daniel clenched his jaw. "They're coming for me." Jake slammed a newspaper onto the desk. The headline read, "Daniel Carter under federal investigation. Corruption charges loom." Jake stared at him. "Do you understand what this means? They're trying to destroy you before you even get started." Daniel exhaled. "I know." Jake hesitated. Then in a low voice he asked, "Do we fight back?" Daniel looked up, and for the first time he smiled. "Of course we fight back." Daniel had spent years studying how the wealthy operated. They didn't just play defense. They played offense. So he fought back the same way they did. He hired private investigators to dig into the people coming after him. He called in favors with journalists to expose their corruption before they could bury him. And most importantly, he found their weakness. It came from an unexpected place. An old business contract. One of Carter Industries' biggest rivals was a powerful hedge fund that had been secretly pulling strings against him. But Daniel had something they didn't expect. Leverage. His legal team discovered an old, forgotten clause in a contract between Carter Industries and the hedge fund. A clause that, if activated, would cost them billions. And Daniel, he activated it. By the time the news broke, the hedge fund CEO was forced to step down. And just like that, the attack stopped. For now, Daniel thought he had won, but then he got the letter. No name, no return address, just a single piece of paper with one sentence. "You don't know who you're playing with." Daniel stared at it for a long time, and for the first time since he took over Carter Industries, he felt fear, because whoever sent this, they weren't done with him yet. Would you fight back if you knew the people coming after you played dirtier than you ever imagined? Daniel Carter wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for survival. But the people who wanted him gone had made a mistake. They thought they were smarter than him. They were wrong. The letter was still in his hands. You don't know who you're playing with. Daniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the words. Most people would take this as a warning. Daniel, he took it as a challenge. Someone wanted him to back down, but he had spent his entire life being underestimated. And now, it was time to make them regret it. If he wanted to fight back, he needed to know exactly who was behind this. So Daniel did what any smart businessman would do. He hired the best investigators money could buy, and within days he had his answer. A secret group of elite financiers had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. They weren't just competitors. They were puppet masters. They controlled politicians, hedge funds, and regulators. And worst of all, they had been helping his father cover up financial crimes for years. His father wasn't just corrupt. He was a pawn. And now, they saw Daniel as a loose end that needed to be erased. Every empire had a weak spot, and Daniel had just found theirs. Buried deep in financial records was something they didn't expect him to find. One of their key figures, Gregory Wallace, a high-profile banker, had been laundering money through a fake charity. Daniel smiled. That was all he needed. Now, it was just a matter of timing. The media storm hit fast. One morning, every major financial news outlet reported that Gregory Wallace was under federal investigation for fraud. Daniel had leaked just enough information to trigger an avalanche. Government agencies swooped in. Regulators froze assets. And before anyone knew what was happening, Gregory Wallace was arrested. His former allies, they scattered. No one wanted to go down with him. And just like that, Daniel had turned the hunters into the hunted. After the scandal broke, Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before they came crawling back. And they did. First, it was the investors who had abandoned him. Then, the bankers who had tried to shut him out. And finally, his own family. One night, Daniel's assistant knocked on his office door. "There's someone here to see you," she said carefully. Daniel looked up. "Who?" She hesitated. "Your father." The room went silent. And then, for the first time in years, Richard Carter walked into his son's office. Richard Carter still had the same arrogant expression, but Daniel saw something else in his father's eyes. Fear. Gone was a powerful CEO. In his place was a desperate man. "You've made some powerful enemies," Richard said carefully. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "So have you," Richard exhaled. "You don't understand how deep this goes." Daniel tilted his head. "Then why are you here?" His father hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Because they're not finished with you yet." Daniel should have known it wasn't over. The men who had tried to ruin him, they didn't just give up. That night, he got a call from Miles Henderson, the accountant who had helped him expose the fraud. "Daniel," Miles said urgently, "you need to get out of the city. Now." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Why?" Miles hesitated. Then he whispered, "Because they just put a bounty on you." Daniel's blood ran cold. And in that moment, he realized the real fight was only just beginning. What would you do if you found out someone put a bounty on your life? Would you run? Would you hide? Or would you do what Daniel Carter did and make your enemies regret ever coming after you? This wasn't just about revenge. This was about power. And Daniel Carter was about to show the world just how powerful he had become. The moment Miles Henderson whispered the words, "They put a bounty on you," Daniel knew he had to act fast. The men who had tried to ruin him weren't just rich. They were dangerous. They had connections in the government, law enforcement, and the underworld. If they wanted him gone, they could make it happen, unless he disappeared first. Within 24 hours, Daniel had left his penthouse, changed his phone, and cut off all unnecessary contact. His team worked from secret locations. His movements were untraceable. And while the world thought he was in hiding, he was working on his biggest move yet. If he wanted to win, he needed to think bigger. Destroying one man wasn't enough. He needed to bring down the entire network of corrupt billionaires who had controlled the system for decades. So Daniel went after the source of their power. He traced their offshore account. He exposed their hidden shell companies. He worked with international regulators to freeze their assets. But the real masterstroke was what he did next. He made it public. One morning, the world woke up to a bombshell. Leaked documents, evidence, names. The media exploded with headlines. Billionaire cartel exposed. Elite businessmen caught in largest financial scandal of the decade. And at the center of it all, Daniel Carter, the man they once mocked for being poor, the man they thought they could erase. Now, he was the most powerful man in the room. The fallout was immediate. Stock markets crashed. CEOs resigned overnight. Politicians distanced themselves from their former allies. And Daniel, he became untouchable. No one could move against him now. He had the law on his side. He had the public on his side. And most importantly, he had power. The same people who once betrayed him now begged for his mercy. One night, Daniel sat in his new office, a massive skyscraper he had just acquired. His assistant knocked. "There's someone here to see you." He glanced up. "Who?" She hesitated. "Your mother." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. Then he nodded. "Send her in." The door opened, and there she stood. The same woman who had turned her back on him when he had nothing. The same woman who once said, "You are not my son anymore." Now, she looked nervous. "Daniel," she whispered. He stared at her. "Why are you here?" Tears filled her eyes. "I made a mistake." Daniel folded his hands on the desk. "A mistake?" She nodded desperately. "I should have believed in you. I should have..." But he cut her off. "You disowned me when I was poor." She swallowed hard. "I was wrong." Daniel leaned back in his chair. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, in a calm, measured voice, he asked, "Are you here because you regret what you did, or because you regret who I became without you?" She had no answer. And in that moment, Daniel knew he didn't need revenge. He had already won. The world now saw Daniel Carter as a business titan. But he knew something most people didn't. Money isn't just about wealth. It's about power, control, and choices. When he was broke, people disrespected him. When he was struggling, they ignored him. But now that he was powerful, they feared him. And that's when he realized the truth. No one values you until they see what they can gain from you. So stop trying to prove yourself to people who only respect power. To build your own. 1 year later, Daniel Carter's name was everywhere. His company was valued at billions. He had become a global business icon. And those who had once tried to destroy him, they were either in prison or bankrupt. And Daniel, he never looked back, because the best revenge isn't anger. It's a success. And Daniel Carter had just written the greatest comeback story of all time. Never beg for approval. Build something so powerful that people have no choice but to respect you. Play the long game. The system is rigged, but smart moves always win. Your past doesn't define you. It doesn't matter where you start. What matters is where you end up. If you learn something from this story, leave a comment below. And if you love stories like this, subscribe for more. Because of this is just the beginning.